In this video, we're going to talk about some research on pornography. Pornography is a very controversial topic. Over the years, people have made the assertion that pornography should be banned or somehow regulated because it promotes violence toward women. And there have been a number of studies done to investigate this. One of the largest studies done was in the early 70s. This study done while Richard Nixon was president was a commission that I think spent 18 months looking at previous research on pornography, conducted its own research on pornography, and after extensive research, they determined that there was no link between pornography and violence. They looked at men who were in prison, who were convicted of rape, and they found that these men were no more likely than the average male to have viewed pornography. They looked at cities and areas in which there was a lot of pornography, like adult bookstores and movie theaters, areas that were not, could find no difference in violence toward women. They looked at countries in which there was a lot of pornography and sexuality, open sexuality, and found that there was really no difference. In other words, there was no evidence at all that pornography in any way was linked toward violence toward women. This study came out in the early 1970s. After that, there wasn't much discussion until about the mid-1980s during the Reagan administration, in which Ronald Reagan, I believe, using one of his cabinet members, Mr. Meese, commissioned another study. Now, this study looked at pornography because in the intervening years between the early 70s and the mid-80s, pornography had blossomed. There was a lot of pornography in society. It had blossomed because of a simple little invention that occurred in the late 70s. And guess what that was? Something that was in every home and got in every home in the late 70s and 80s, became very popular. And this little invention was called the video cassette recorder, the VCR. And when people could watch movies in their homes, what did they want to watch? Not Fantasia and Snow White. They wanted to watch pornography. So the pornography industry blossomed, it bloomed, it grew because there was a great demand for it. Now, pornography had a problem. The problem that it had was, what makes one pornographic movie different than another? Well, they have the sex, and they photograph them, and they move around, and, the couple has sex, and the next door neighbor comes over, and grandma comes over, maybe the dog if it's kinky, and they have sex. And after a while, it's like the same thing done over and over. So the makers of pornography, I reckon, got the idea, let's throw in what Americans like. And what do Americans like besides sex? Violence. They like violence. They want violence. So they started making films that tied in sexuality with violence. Like one that I saw, I had to watch it because I'm a sociologist. I wouldn't have seen it. Okay. The movie was called Waiting at the Altar. And in this movie, the first scene is this woman's waiting there for her fiance to show up and marry her. And of course, he doesn't show up. They're in the backyard, the family's there, the minister's there, everybody's dressed. She doesn't show up. And this scene only lasts for a minute or two because they don't want to waste time in a porno movie showing you people with clothes on. So, cut. Next scene's 2 weeks later. It's a dark night. It's raining. It's stormy. This woman is upstairs in a nice, sexy nightgown, laying in bed. And at 2 a.m, the doorbell rings. And she does what every sane woman would do at 2 a.m. When the doorbell rings, she went downstairs and opened the door. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Guess who's there? Come on, It's the fiancé that left her standing at the altar. And he apologizes. He's drunk. He's crying. He's saying, I'm sorry, I did this. And I left you at the altar and all this. And she's saying, you pig, you dog, get away. She's pushing him away. He starts trying to kiss her, and he starts throwing her down on the floor in the living room. And what's happening here is that we see a sex scene starting to evolve. He starts tearing off her clothes and kissing her and forcing himself upon her, but this is a rape scene. Because all the time she's protesting his advances, but he's still forcing himself upon her, and he begins a sexual act. This is actually a rape scene. And then partly through the rape scene, she decides that she likes it, and all of a sudden she goes crazy, and she's screaming and yelling. So a rape scene now turns into a consensual sex scene. Now, pornographic films did this because they wanted to sell their videos. They wanted to add a little violence, a little excitement in. But there's a kind of disturbing message. And this disturbing message was, when women say no, they really mean yes. And that's a message I don't think we want out there. And because of these kinds of porno films and these kinds of messages, in the mid-1980s, we have now the Mies Commission looking at pornography. The problem with the Mies Commission, unlike the commission that was there in the early 1970s under Nixon, the Mies Commission appears to be rather biased. They're not using a lot of scientific data. They're using opinions that people have about pornography doing this and that, but nothing that you can say is good, solid evidence that pornography is creating problems. So they're looking for research. And then they do something that's a trick you got to be aware of. They find some research that was done by a researcher in California in which he did the following. He took a group of men. He gave them a questionnaire. Let's use the letter Q. And so he gave them a questionnaire, and then he showed them a pornographic film. And so this film he showed them was like the one I mentioned, pornography mixed with violence. And then he gave them another questionnaire. What did he want to see? Whether or not, if these men saw a film with pornography and violence, and they took this questionnaire, and then they took it after the film, would their values change? Now, what was on this questionnaire? That's the key. What was on this questionnaire were their attitudes toward women and sexuality, toward whether or not women like to be forced into sex, to whether or not when women said no, they really mean yes. And so the questionnaire is asking male attitudes toward sexuality toward women. They show these men a film containing pornography and violence, like the one I mentioned, Waiting at the Altar, and then they give them the questionnaire again. And guess what? Is there a change in attitudes? Yeah. And the second questionnaire is shown after the film. Guess what? There's a change in attitudes in which men are now more inclined to, how can we say, I hate to use this word, favor violence toward women and sexuality. And in fact, I believe in one group of men, close to half of the men said they would consider rape if they thought they could get away with it. Wow. Men made comments like, when a woman dresses in a sexual fashion, she's looking to have sex. These are disturbing changes. Mies Commission releases this and they say, look, we got evidence. Try to hold it up here. Give a questionnaire. Show a pornographic film with violence. Questionnaire again. They say, look, what do we get? We get violence. We get a change in attitudes toward violence. So the Mies Commission says, we've got evidence. But then this shows you the problem with researchers, people reporting research who do not give you all the facts. The man who actually did the research got very, very upset because the Mies Commission did not report all of his findings. And here's the rest of his findings. He took another group of men, notice this, gave them a questionnaire about attitudes toward women, showed them a pornographic film, notice the P, no violence, gave them a questionnaire again. Questionnaire on attitudes toward women and sexuality and violence, pornographic film, just, good old-fashioned pornographic film. Boy meets girl and has sex for 2 hours, and maybe asks the neighbors, grandma and the dog to come over. That's a joke about the dog. Give them a questionnaire again. But look this, NV. NV stands for no violence. In other words, there was not a change in attitudes. After seeing a pornographic film with no violence, the males were not inclined to have changed their attitudes in the direction of favoring or accepting more violence toward women. But it gets even more exciting and more interesting. The real truth of the study is in the very last one here. And here it is. He gave a group of men, Q, another questionnaire. And then he took this other group of men and he showed them a violent film, no pornography, violence. And he gave the same group of men another questionnaire, again looking at their attitudes toward women and sexuality toward women. And notice the V. The men's attitudes changed again, this time in a direction of favoring or tolerating or accepting violence toward women. So the question now becomes, look at the whole sheet. First one, questionnaire, pornography and violence. Questionnaire again, change in attitudes toward violence. Second one, questionnaire, films with just pornography. Questionnaire again, NV, no change toward violence, non-violence. Third one, the big one. We see a questionnaire, a film, which is violence, Rambo, some old shoot 'em up, kill 'em movie, questionnaire, and the attitude changes again. So you tell me now, what is the real link? The real link in the movies, it's not the pornography, it's the violence. And this is a good example of how we look at research, and we look when people report on research and say, wait a minute, did you tell everything? Because when the Meese Commission did the study on pornography, it was a biased study. They did not very often talk to scientists. They talked to just people who had opinions. And like the study I just showed you, when they did report a study, they left out very important details and facts. Because when you have all the details and facts, now we find that in this particular case, no evidence that pornography contributes to violence. So what do we conclude? We conclude that in this very controversial topic with pornography, there's no link between pornography and violence toward women. It's just something people have believed, and it's not supported at all by the evidence.